The weak yellow light of the single bare bulb overhead cast long shadows across the small apartment, making the peeling paint on the walls look like weeping sores. Helen's fingers, trembling slightly, smoothed out the wrinkled dollar bills on the rickety kitchen table for the 10th time. $400 bills, worn and soft as old cloth. 9 20s, 1 10, a 5. The rest was a sad pile of coins she had scraped from the bottom of her purse and an old jam jar. She counted them again, the metallic clinking of quarters and dimes a hollow, tinny sound in the oppressive silence. $500. Exactly. It was the last of her savings, the final payment from a dress alteration, and all that stood between her and total destitution. A sour, acidic taste rose in her throat, the taste of fear. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the cold, hard knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The eviction notice, a crisp, cruel piece of paper, lay next to the money, its bold red letters a stark reminder that time was a luxury she no longer had. In the other room, a small alcove separated by a hanging sheet, her 10-year-old son, Lucas, slept. Helen could hear his soft, even breathing, a gentle rhythm of innocence that felt like a knife in her heart. She felt a wave of nausea, a physical manifestation of her failure. A year had passed since her husband's death, a year of watching their meager savings drain away like sand through her fingers, devoured by hospital bills and the slow, agonizing decline of a man she adored. She had promised him she would take care of Lucas. Now the smell of hunger was starting to cling to their clothes, a faint, sweetish odor of want. She crept to the doorway and watched her son, his face relaxed in sleep, one hand clutching the worn teddy bear that had been his father's last gift. Silent tears began to trace cold paths down her cheeks. The weight of her love for him was crushing, matched only by the suffocating weight of her shame. She was failing him. The thought was a constant, throbbing ache behind her eyes. Her stomach growled, a low, painful cramp that made her double over for a moment, pressing a hand against the emptiness. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. Making sure Lucas had the last of the bread and the single egg she'd found at the back of the fridge, she opened the refrigerator door now, the weak interior light illuminating the desolate, barren shelves, a half-empty jar of mustard, a plastic container with a few spoonfuls of margarine. That was it. The air that wafted out was cold and smelled of nothing. In the corner of the living room, her sewing machine sat under a dusty cover, a silent monument to her dying trade. Orders had dried up. No one wanted a seamstress when they could buy cheap clothes online. Her hands, calloused and pricked from a lifetime of needlework, felt useless. She ran a finger over the cool metal of the machine, the smooth surface, a stark contrast to the rough, splintered wood of the table, where their entire worldly wealth lay exposed. The eviction notice seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy under the dim light. Final notice to vacate. The words were like a physical blow. The date, the end of the month, was only a week away. Helen could feel the walls of the tiny apartment closing in, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television, the sound of a game show, of canned laughter and cheerful music. It felt like it was coming from another planet, a world of warmth and security she and Lucas were about to be violently ejected from. Her mind conjured a terrifying image, herself and Lucas on the street, huddled in a doorway, their few possessions in a tattered suitcase. A shiver, cold and sharp, ran down her spine, and she hugged her arms tightly around her thin frame, as if she could physically hold herself together. The city, with its millions of glittering lights visible from her smudged window, had never felt so vast, so cold, so terrifyingly indifferent. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her gaze flitting between the meager pile of money, the stark eviction notice, and the thin curtain behind which her son slept peacefully, unaware of the cliff edge they were teetering on. The silence of the night pressed in, broken only by the frantic, panicked thumping of her own heart. This was it, the bottom. A profound, bone-deep coldness settled over her, the certainty that she was utterly and completely alone. Hope was a flicker she could no longer feel, extinguished by the relentless tide of debt and despair. She closed her eyes, and a single, hot tear escaped, rolling down her cheek like a final admission of defeat. With only $500 separating her child from the streets, A mother's heart shatters in the silent dark. What path would you choose when every road seems to lead to ruin? If you've ever felt the crushing weight of the world on your shoulders, subscribe and follow Helen's journey, because her story of desperation is only just beginning. It was in the dead of night, when the city's hum finally softened to a low thrum, that a flicker of an idea ignited within Helen. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, her mind a frantic carousel of terror and failure. To stop the spinning, she turned to a stack of old newspapers her landlord had left out for recycling, the cheap paper smelling of dust and forgotten time. Her fingers, smudged with ink, flew across the pages, scanning the endless columns of text. She wasn't looking for news of the world. She was desperately hunting for a lifeline, a cleaning job, a live-in care position, anything that offered a roof, however temporary. The red-lettered date on the eviction notice was seared into her brain, a ticking clock counting down to oblivion. Her heart pounded a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. The air in the small apartment felt thick, heavy with the scent of their impending homelessness. She had to find something. She just had to. Her desperation was a physical ache, a raw, open wound in her soul. Her eyes, raw and burning from exhaustion, snagged on a tiny, unassuming box in the classified section of a yellowed paper from a rural county she'd never heard of. The print was small, the words simple: cabin for sale, lakeside property, land included. Inquire for low price. The words seemed to shimmer on the page, a mirage in her desert of despair. A fragile, impossible hope began to bloom in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in over a year. She read the ad again, and then a third time, her breath catching in her throat. Lakeside property, land included. It sounded like a fairy tale, a place where Lucas could run and play, where she could finally breathe again. The phrase, low price, was a siren song. It had to be a misprint. It had to be a cruel joke. And yet, what if it wasn't? What if it was the one single miracle she had been praying for? The thought was so powerful, so intoxicating, it momentarily eclipsed the crushing reality of her situation, offering a sliver of light in the suffocating dark. The decision was not a choice. It was a reflex, an instinct for survival kicking in. The alternative was a guaranteed slide into the abyss of the streets, a horror she could not let Lucas face. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number from the Addy, her voice a reedy, hesitant thing when a gruff man answered. He sounded impatient, disinterested. The price is $500 for the down payment, non-refundable. You take the property as is. Wire the money and it's yours. I'll mail the keys. The words, as is, were a small, red flag, but the roaring in her ears, the sound of her own frantic hope, drowned it out completely. Yes, she heard herself say, the word rushing out before she could second-guess it. I'll take it. A few minutes later, standing at a 24-hour wire service, she sent every last cent she had to a name she didn't know, for a place she had never seen. As the clerk handed her the receipt, her hands were slick with sweat, her stomach churning with a volatile cocktail of terror and exhilaration. The journey was an odyssey of exhaustion and frayed nerves. They sold the few pieces of furniture they owned for a handful of dollars, just enough for the bus tickets and some bread and peanut butter. Their entire world was condensed into 2 battered suitcases and a cardboard box sealed with straining tape. The bus ride was a day-long bone-rattling affair. The vehicle smelled of stale cigarette smoke and diesel fumes, the seats worn and sticky. Helen held Lucas's small hand, her own knuckles white, and tried to weave a story of their new life. There will be a big lake, Buddy, she murmured, her voice strained with forced cheerfulness. We can go fishing, and we'll plant a garden. Lucas, with the beautiful, unwavering faith of a child, stared out the grimy window at the blur of passing country, his eyes wide with excitement. But beneath Helen's brave words, a cold knot of anxiety was tightening in her gut. She had staked everything on a ghost of a chance. The bus hissed to a stop at a desolate crossroads, leaving them in a cloud of exhaust. A single, rust-eaten signpost pointed down a narrow dirt track. Blackwood Lake, 5 miles. The silence that descended was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant drone of the city. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp soil, pine and something wild and untamed. It was a silence that felt heavy, watchful. They began to walk. their meager luggage bumping awkwardly against their legs. The sun, which had been a warm presence, vanished behind a blanket of bruised grey clouds. A cold drizzle began to fall, soaking their thin jackets. Each step was an effort, the mud on the track sucking at the worn soles of their shoes. Lucas's initial excitement slowly faded, replaced by a weary quiet. Helen's forced smile felt frozen on her face, a brittle mask threatening to crack. The hope that had fueled her was beginning to feel dangerously thin. The further they walked, the more the path seemed to dissolve into the wilderness. Overgrown bushes with sharp thorns snagged their clothes, and the dirt track became a muddy trench. The sense of peace she had imagined was replaced by a creeping primal fear. The isolation was no longer a promise of solitude, but a terrifying threat. The air grew colder, carrying a distinct, unpleasant scent of decay and stagnant water. Helen's heart, which had been aflutter with hope, now hammered a frantic rhythm of pure panic against her ribs. Lucas stumbled, and she caught him, his small body trembling with cold and exhaustion. "Are we almost there, Mum?" he asked, his voice small in the vast, oppressive quiet of the woods. "Almost, sweetie," she lied, her own voice barely a whisper. The forest felt like it was closing in, the gnarled, dark trees like silent hostile witnesses to their foolish pilgrimage. She felt a profound sense of being watched, judged by the ancient woods. Then, through a gap in the trees, they saw it, the cabin, and in that one heart-stopping moment, the last vestiges of Helen's hope were utterly and violently extinguished. The sight was so much worse than anything her anxious mind could have conjured. It wasn't a cabin, it was a carcass, a skeleton of a house, picked clean by time and neglect. A huge, jagged hole gaped in the center of the tin roof, like a wound open to the weeping sky. The front porch sagged at a drunken angle, its wooden steps rotted away to nothing. The entire structure leaned precariously to one side, looking as if a single strong gust of wind would be enough to bring it all crashing down into a pile of splinters. A choked, guttural sound escaped Helen's throat. It was the sound of her spirit breaking. This was not a home. This was a grave, and she had just buried herself and her son in it. The $500, their entire world, had bought them this nightmare. As they drew closer, a wave of stench washed over them, so thick and foul it made Helen gag. It was the smell of years of dampness, of black mold spreading its cancerous tendrils, mixed with the sharp, musky odor of animal filth. The windows were shattered, leaving dark, vacant holes that stared out like the empty eye sockets of a skull. A massive, dark stain, slick with moisture, crept up one of the walls from the foundation, the wooden planks beneath it soft and crumbling like wet cardboard. Helen felt Lucas flinch beside her, his small hand gripping hers with painful intensity. The shame that flooded her was a physical force, hot and acidic, rising in her throat. She had promised him a safe haven, a new beginning. Instead, she had brought him to a place of decay and horror. The hope she had sold him, the dream of a lakeside home, felt like the cruelest betrayal of all. This was not a step up from eviction. It was a plunge into a far deeper, more terrifying pit of despair. With a trembling hand, Helen pushed on the front door. It shrieked in protest on a single, rusted hinge before sagging open, threatening to fall from its frame. The horror continued inside. The air was a toxic miasma of mold, so thick and suffocating it was difficult to draw a full breath. It coated the back of her throat with an earthy, poisonous taste. Gloomy grey light filtered through the hole in the roof, illuminating pools of stagnant rainwater on the warped or buckled floorboards. Thick, dusty cobwebs hung from the rafters, like funeral shrouds. From a dark corner came a frantic scurrying sound, followed by a high-pitched squeak. Rats. The sound made her blood run cold. She could smell them now, their acrid, greasy scent mingling with the rot. She had spent her last dollar, dragged her child for miles, all for this, for a rat-infested, rotting, leaking hovel. The sheer, monumental stupidity of her actions crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. She stumbled through the single, desolate room, her shoes making soft, squelching sounds on the wet floor. The only furniture was a three-legged chair leaning against a wall, and a small table that looked as if it had been gnawed by insects. There was no electricity. She could see the frayed, useless wires hanging from a ceiling beam like dead vines. There was no running water, The overwhelming reality of her situation settled upon her like a lead-lined blanket. She had traded a tiny, crumbling apartment in the city for this. This was infinitely worse. Here, there were no neighbors to hear them scream, no corner store, no bus stop. There was nothing, just the wilderness, the rot, and the crushing, absolute isolation. She had gambled everything on a desperate hope, and now she saw the truth. The game had been rigged from the start. She was a fool, and she had trapped her son in the consequence of her foolishness. Her frantic gaze landed on the one other feature the man on the phone had mentioned, the old stone well in the overgrown yard. This was to be their source of water for drinking, for washing. It was a circular structure of grey, moss-covered stones, choked with thorny weeds and thick vines that coiled around it like snakes. The wooden lid was warped and splintered, half rotted through. With a sense of deep foreboding, Helen used a fallen branch to pry it open. A wave of cold, musty air rushed up to meet her, smelling of deep, dark earth, wet stone, and things long dead. She peered down into the shaft and saw only an inky, profound blackness. The idea of lowering a bucket into that dark abyss, of pulling up whatever lurked in that stagnant water and giving it to her son to drink, filled her with a primal sense of revulsion. Every single detail of their new home was a fresh torment, a new layer of hell. The sheer, terrifying totality of their isolation finally hit her with its full force. Standing by the menacing well, she scanned the horizon in every direction. There was nothing. No other rooftops, no plumes of smoke, no distant roads, only an unbroken, menacing wall of dark green and black forest pressing in on them from all sides. The only sound was the sighing of the wind through the pines and the occasional, mournful cry of a loon from the unseen lake, a sound that amplified their loneliness rather than easing it. She had dreamed of a peaceful escape, a quiet refuge to heal her broken family. Instead, she had marooned them on an island of despair, miles from civilization, with no resources and no means of escape. The profound silence of the place was no longer peaceful. It was a living, breathing entity, a suffocating presence that seemed to mock her, to whisper that she was completely, utterly alone and no one was coming to help. "Mommy, I'm scared." Lucas's voice was a tiny, trembling thing, a fragile sound in the vast, hostile silence. The words shattered the last of Helen's composure. She spun around and pulled him into a fierce, desperate embrace, trying to shield his small body with her own, as if she could protect him from the terrifying reality of her catastrophic error in judgment. She could feel him shivering uncontrollably, a combination of cold, fear, and exhaustion. "It's okay, baby. We're okay," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Her own throat was tight, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She would not cry in front of him, but as she held him, the cold dampness of the rotting cabin seemed to seep through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. It felt like the cold hand of the grave itself, a chilling premonition of the struggle that lay ahead. This place was not a sanctuary, it was a trap. As dusk began to bleed across the grey sky, the interior of the cabin was plunged into a deep and terrifying darkness. The shadows writhed and stretched, taking on monstrous forms in the gloom. Helen fumbled in her bag for one of the few candles she had packed. Its small sputtering flame was a feeble defense against the oppressive blackness, casting long, dancing shadows that made the mold on the walls look like grasping hands. Every creak of the decaying wood, every skittering sound from within the walls, was amplified in the silence, sounding like a direct and immediate threat. The cold was a physical entity now, a biting, damp chill that crept in through the broken windows and the gaping hole in the roof. Helen and Lucas huddled together on the floor, wrapped in a single thin blanket, their own shivering bodies the only source of warmth. The gnawing ache of hunger in Helen's stomach was a constant, painful reminder of their utter destitution. This was it, the absolute bottom. It was a despair so profound, it made her previous life in the city, with its eviction notice and empty refrigerator, seem like a paradise. There, at least, there had been a sliver of hope, the possibility of a solution. Here, in this rotting shack in the middle of a dark, indifferent wilderness, hope was an absurdity. It was a language she no longer understood. She had gambled her son's safety and lost in the most spectacular way imaginable. She had led him from a bad situation directly into a nightmare, a single, hot tear finally escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek, landing silently on Lucas's hair. The weight of her failure was a physical, crushing presence. She closed her eyes, not to pray, but to surrender to the overwhelming blackness, both outside and within. She had nothing left. No money, no food, no plan, no escape. Only the suffocating darkness and the scratching of rats in the walls of her family's new tomb. The dawn was not an arrival of light, but a deepening of grey. The drizzle had not stopped, its incessant patter on the tin roof a constant, miserable percussion. A raw, biting hunger was a twisting knot in Helen's stomach, but a more primal need screamed louder: thirst. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and she watched with a pang of guilt as Lucas licked his dry, cracked lips. The memory of clean water flowing from a tap felt like a fantasy from another life. Her gaze, filled with dread, fixed on the old stone well in the yard. It loomed in the misty morning light, a grim monument to their desolation. The thought of what lurked in its black, stagnant depths made her skin crawl. But they had no choice. Survival was a brutal master, stripping away all comfort, all preference, taking a deep, shaky breath that tasted of mold and wet earth. She grabbed a rusted, dented bucket they'd found, the cold metal shocking her skin, and stepped out into the mud. Lucas, his small face pale and drawn, followed her silently, a little shadow of misery. The air outside was thick and heavy, each breath a swallow of damp, mossy chill. As they reached the well, the smell intensified, a potent mixture of cold stone, decaying leaves, and the unnerving scent of deep, undisturbed water. Helen felt a wave of revulsion, her stomach churning. This was their only source of water, this dark, silent hole. She fought back a surge of nausea. She had to be strong for Lucas. With a grunt of effort, she and her son worked together to slide the heavy, waterlogged wooden lid aside, revealing the inky blackness of the shaft. The cold that wafted up from it was ancient and tomb-like. It seemed to pull the warmth from their bodies. Helen avoided looking into the abyss, her focus fixed on the frayed rope tied to the bucket. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. She felt a tremor of pure fear, an irrational certainty that if she leaned too far, the well would swallow her whole, pulling her down into its cold, silent depths. As Helen fumbled with the rope, her fingers clumsy with cold and anxiety, Lucas, driven by a child's simple, direct curiosity, leaned over the stone rim. He wasn't looking into the dark water, but at the circular wall of the well shaft itself. "Mom," he said, his voice a small, clear note in the oppressive quiet. "Look, this one's wiggly." Helen, preoccupied with her task, barely registered his words. "Be careful, Lucas. Don't lean over." But he persisted, his voice rising with excitement. "No, really, look." He pointed to a spot just below the rim, a single grey stone, darker than the others and slick with green moss. While the other stones were locked tight with ancient mortar, this one seemed to sit slightly askew. Intrigued despite her fear, Helen moved closer. Lucas was right. While the surrounding stones were immovable, this one had a visible gap around it. He pushed at it with his small fingers, and it shifted, a low, grating sound of stone on stone echoing in the well's throat. A flicker of something other than despair sparked in Helen's chest. It was curiosity, sharp and unexpected. She knelt in the mud beside her son, her earlier revulsion momentarily forgotten. She pressed her own fingers into the gap around the stone. It was definitely loose. It wasn't just a degraded piece of the structure. It felt deliberately unset. Together, they worked their fingers into the slimy cracks, pulling and wiggling. The stone was heavy, and for a moment it refused to budge. Helen's muscles strained, the rough surface scraping her knuckles. Then, with a final, sucking pop, it came free. The sound was surprisingly loud in the morning quiet. She stumbled back, the heavy, moss-covered stone in her hands, her heart suddenly pounding a new, unfamiliar rhythm. It wasn't the frantic drumbeat of fear, but the quick, excited pulse of discovery. For the first time since their arrival, a sliver of light had pierced the suffocating gloom of their reality. Behind the stone was not more earth or mortar, but a perfectly carved niche, a small, dark cubbyhole hidden from the world for who knew how long. The air that puffed out from the opening was dry and smelled faintly of rust and old tobacco. It was a man-made space, a secret. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Helen's spine. Nestled inside the dark recess was a small metal object. Her hand trembled as she reached into the hole, her fingers brushing against cold, textured metal. She pulled it out into the grey light. It was a tobacco tin, rectangular and rusted shut, its painted label long since faded into a mottled brown and orange pattern. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, but it had a surprising weight to it. She and Lucas stared at it, their breath fogging in the cold air. The world, with its hunger and its ruinous cabin, seemed to fall away. In this moment, there was only the box and its silent promise. "What is it, Mom? What's inside?" Lucas's whisper was filled with a breathless awe. Helen didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of possibilities. She sat back on her heels in the mud, turning the tin over and over in her hands. It was sealed tight, rusted by decades of dampness. She tried to pry it open with her fingernails, but the metal wouldn't budge. A frantic urgency seized her. She looked around, her eyes landing on the stone she had just removed. Using its sharp edge, she began to scrape and pry at the lid of the tin. The sound of metal scraping against metal was harsh and grating, setting her teeth on edge. It felt like she was trying to unlock a piece of the past itself. Finally, with a sharp crack, the rusted seal broke. The lid popped open, revealing the contents that had been hidden from the light for an age. A sense of profound significance washed over her, a feeling that their lives were about to change. The tin did not contain money or jewels, not at first glance. Instead, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried, crumbled tobacco leaves, were two objects. The first was a key. It wasn't a modern house key, but an old, ornate one, made of heavy, tarnished brass. It was solid and intricately shaped, the kind of key that belonged to a heavy wooden chest or a very old, very important door. The weight of it in her palm felt substantial, real. It was a key to a lock somewhere, a key to a secret. The cold metal seemed to hum with a latent energy, a story waiting to be unlocked. Helen's heart hammered in her chest. This was no random discovery. This was a deliberate clue, left by someone long ago for someone else to find. The mystery of it was a potent antidote to her despair, a surge of adrenaline that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't for months. She felt a sudden, electric connection to the past, to the person who had hidden this. The second item was a small, folded piece of leather, cracked and stiff with age. It felt brittle, and Helen handled it with extreme care, her fingers trembling as she gently unfolded it. The leather smelled faintly of tannin and earth. Drawn on the inside in what looked like faded black ink was a crude but clear floor plan of the cabin. It was unmistakable. The single large room, the fireplace, the outline of the cellar door, and in the corner of the drawing that represented the cellar, there was a small dark X, a treasure map. It was the stuff of children's stories, but here it was, real and tangible in her hands, a map and a key. A cold knot of excitement and fear tightened in her gut. She looked from the map to the decrepit cabin, then to her son's wide, hopeful eyes. The rotting hovel no longer looked like a tomb. It now looked like a puzzle, a place that held a secret far more important than its decaying walls. The oppressive weight of their situation hadn't vanished, but it had been joined by a powerful new force, purpose. "The cellar," Helen whispered, her voice hoarse. They left the bucket by the well, the need for water momentarily forgotten, eclipsed by the burning need to solve the riddle they had just unearthed. Back inside the cabin, the stench of mold and decay seemed less potent, the shadows less menacing. Helen's eyes immediately found the trapdoor to the cellar, a crude square of wood set into the main floor, its iron ring handle flush with the warped planks. It was a place she had been avoiding, imagining it filled with rats and spiders and stagnant water. But now, it was the target. It was the X on the map. She felt a surge of nervous energy. Her earlier exhaustion completely burned away by a volatile mix of hope and trepidation. She gripped the cold iron ring, her knuckles white, and pulled with all her might. The trapdoor resisted, swollen shut by years of dampness. It was Lucas who found a discarded iron bar near the crumbling fireplace, likely an old poker. Using it as a lever, Helen wedged it into the crack and put her full weight on it. The wood groaned and splintered. With a final, shuddering crack, the door flew open, slamming against the floor and releasing a blast of cold, subterranean air. The smell that billowed out was even worse than the cabin's, a thick, suffocating stench of cold, damp earth, mildew, and something indescribably ancient, like air that hadn't moved in 50 years. It was the smell of a crypt. Helen felt a primal urge to slam the door shut, to forget the map and the key, to run from whatever secrets were buried in that darkness. But Lucas's face, illuminated by the grey daylight from the door, was alight with fearless curiosity. Seeing his courage, she found her own. She lit one of their few precious candles, and its small, flickering flame revealed a set of steep, rickety stone steps descending into utter blackness. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Stay here," she told Lucas, her voice firmer than she felt. "Just wait at the top." She took a deep breath, the candle flame trembling in her unsteady hand, and began to descend. Each step was slick with a thin layer of slime, and she placed her feet with extreme caution. The cold intensified with every step, seeping into her bones. The candlelight cast huge, dancing shadows that writhed on the stone walls, making it feel as if the very darkness were alive and breathing around her. The air was so thick and stale it was hard to breathe. The small flame illuminated a tiny circle of a cramped, earthen-floored space. The walls were rough-hewn stone, weeping with moisture that glistened like black tears in the flickering light. The silence was absolute, a heavy, pressing weight that felt like it could crush her. Her own ragged breathing sounded deafeningly loud. She held the leather map in her other hand, its image seared into her memory. The X was in a corner to the left of the stairs. She moved slowly, her free hand trailing along the cold, slimy wall for balance. The candle flame dipped and sputtered, threatening to extinguish and leave her in total darkness. Her stomach clenched with fear. This was madness. She was in a dark, wet hole under a ruined house in the middle of nowhere, chasing a fantasy born from a rusty tin box. The despair she had felt before began to creep back, cold and familiar. What if this was a dead end? A child's game? A cruel joke played by the past? But then her fingers, tracing the stone wall, brushed against something different. A mark. A chiseled X, carved crudely into the surface of one of the large foundation stones. It was exactly where the map said it would be. A jolt of adrenaline shot through her, erasing all doubt. This was real. She held the candle closer. The X was unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. She set the candle down on a nearby ledge, its flame casting an unsteady glow over the marked stone. She pressed against it with her hands, but it was solid, unmoving. She knocked on it with her knuckles. The sound was a dull thud. She knocked on the stones around it, producing the same solid, dense sound. Then she knocked on the marked stone again, harder this time, and she heard it. A subtle difference, a faint but distinct hollowness. It was a sound that didn't belong, a pocket of air where there should have been solid earth and rock. A gasp escaped her lips. It wasn't just a mark, it was a marker. The map wasn't pointing to a spot, it was pointing to a specific stone, the false wall. Her mind reeled with the implications. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to hide something here. Frantically, she looked around the small, dark space for a tool. Her eyes landed on the iron bar she had used to open the trap door, which she had carried down with her. It was heavy and rusted, but it was solid. She wedged the tip of the bar into the seam above the marked stone. Gritting her teeth, she pushed. The metal scraped against the stone, the sound echoing unnervingly in the small chamber. Nothing happened. She repositioned the bar, finding a better purchase, and threw her entire weight against it. Her muscles screamed in protest, sweat breaking out on her brow and stinging her eyes. The stone groaned, a low, deep sound of protest from the earth. A thin crack of blackness appeared. She pushed again, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The stone shifted, grinding against its neighbors. It was working. A wild, almost manic energy surged through her. She was on the verge of uncovering a secret that had slept for generations. With a final, desperate heave, the stone tilted forward and fell to the earthen floor with a heavy, dull thud that shook the ground. Behind it was not a gaping hole there, but a carefully constructed cavity, its interior lined with thick, black waterproof canvas. The air that emerged was dry, smelling not of damp earth, but of old leather and something else, a faint, metallic tang. The secret compartment was about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, a deliberately crafted void within the foundation of the house, and sitting squarely in the center of this hidden space, as if waiting for her, was a large, heavy-looking suitcase. It was made of dark, rich leather, with sturdy brass clasps and reinforced corners. It was old, but it had been protected from the damp and was in remarkably good condition. Helen simply stared, her mind unable to fully process what she was seeing. The candlelight flickered over the brass, making it glint like a pirate's chest. For a long moment, she was frozen, caught between disbelief and a terror-laced excitement. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She could hear Lucas calling from the top of the stairs, his voice a distant, muffled query. "Mom, are you okay?" She couldn't form a response. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the leather of the suitcase. It was cool and smooth. It was real. This wasn't a dream. This was happening. Slowly, carefully, she dragged the suitcase out of the compartment. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than an empty suitcase should be. It took all her strength to pull it out onto the cellar floor. The sheer weight of it made her hopes soar to impossible heights. What could be so heavy? Her mind flashed with images of gold bars, of solid silver, things she had only ever seen in movies. The reality of it was too overwhelming, too far outside the realm of her own miserable existence. The suitcase wasn't locked. The 2 brass clasps on the front were stiff but unfastened. With her heart in her throat, Helen knelt before it on the damp earth. The small candle flame cast a circle of warm, dancing light in the oppressive dark, illuminating the scene with a dramatic and almost sacred glow. Her fingers, slick with sweat and grime, fumbled with the first clasp. It sprang open with a loud click that echoed in the silence. She unfastened the second. Another click. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a prayer and a curse all in one, and slowly, ceremoniously, lifted the heavy leather lid. The sight that greeted her stole the air from her lungs and made the world tilt on its axis. Her mind simply refused to comprehend it. For a stunned second, she thought she was looking at bags of rocks or dirt. The case was filled to the brim with dozens of small, discolored velvet bags, each tied shut with a thin, faded cord. She reached in and picked one up. It was small and fitting easily in her palm, but it was shockingly heavy, a dense, satisfying weight. The velvet was soft and worn, but the fabric was still strong. Her fingers, trembling with an almost unbearable anticipation, struggled with the tight knot of the drawstring. She pulled and twisted, her nails digging into the cord until it finally came loose. She tilted the bag, still not quite believing. What spilled out into her palm wasn't rocks. It was gold, old gold coins, of different sizes and designs, gleaming with a deep, rich, buttery luster in the flickering candlelight. They were heavy, solid, and cool to the touch. They made a soft, musical clinking sound as they settled in her hand. A choked sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. She grabbed another bag, and another. More coins. Gold, all of them. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of them. The sheer, staggering value of it all was incomprehensible. It was a fortune. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than she could ever imagine. It was a literal treasure. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to place a hand on the cold ground to steady herself. Her vision swam. This was the answer. This was salvation. This was not just a roof over their heads or food on the table. This was a new life, a complete and total eradication of the poverty and fear that had been her constant companions. In some of the bags, mixed with the coins, were pieces of jewelry. A diamond ring that threw dazzling shards of light from the candle flame, a string of heavy pearls, their surface opalescent and smooth, a delicate gold necklace, a sapphire pendant gleaming like a drop of deep blue water. Each piece was a small fortune in itself. It was the wealth of kings, hidden in the dirt beneath a ruined shack. As her initial shock began to subside, replaced by a dawning, euphoric reality, she noticed something else at the bottom of the suitcase. The bags of treasure did not fill the entire space. Beneath them, wrapped carefully in a swathe of oilcloth, was another object. It was hard and rectangular. Setting a handful of the heavy velvet bags aside, the gold coins spilling across the leather, she carefully lifted the bundle. Unwrapping the protective cloth, she revealed a book. It was a diary, with a thick, hardcover binding of dark green leather. The pages were edged in gold. Though they were now yellowed and brittle with age, there was no title on the cover, no name. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of secrets. A chill, unrelated to the cellar's cold, prickled her skin. The gold was the what. This diary, she felt with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, was the why. She opened the cover. The first page was filled with elegant but severe, cursive handwriting. The ink was a faded sepia tone. But as her eyes scanned the words, a knot of confusion and disappointment formed in her stomach. She couldn't read a single word. It wasn't English. The script was unfamiliar, full of sharp, angular letters and strange grammatical marks. She flipped through the pages. Page after page was filled with the same dense, unreadable script. Dates at the top of each entry confirmed it was a journal, spanning several years, but the language was a complete barrier. Then, on a later page, she recognized a single, infamous, terrifying symbol, drawn next to a signature, a swastika, and beneath it, a name written in the same severe script. The language, she realized with a jolt of cold dread, was German. The story of this treasure was far darker than a simple family fortune. The golden coins suddenly felt cold and heavy in a different way. The beautiful jewelry seemed to lose some of its luster. The initial, pure joy of her discovery was instantly tainted by a dark and menacing question. Who was the author of this diary? And where, exactly, had this incredible wealth come from? She felt a premonition, a cold certainty that the words in this book told a story not of thrift and savings, but of theft and tragedy on an unimaginable scale. The treasure was not a gift from a benevolent ancestor. It was plunder. The weight of this realization was as heavy as the gold itself. She had stumbled upon not just a fortune, but a dark secret from history. A secret that had been buried here in the dark earth for decades. A secret that now, for better or for worse, belonged to her. The key she'd found didn't just open a box. It had unlocked a ghost. The air in the cellar suddenly felt colder, more menacing. The shadows cast by the candle seemed to lengthen, twisting into accusatory shapes. Helen felt a profound sense of trespass, as if the ghost of the diary's author was standing right behind her in the dark, watching her. She quickly began to gather the spilled coins, her hands now moving with a nervous, hurried energy. The feel of the gold was no longer just a promise of salvation. It now carried the chilling touch of its history. She stuffed the velvet bags back into the suitcase, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a still powerful undercurrent of hope. This was complicated, terribly, dangerously complicated. But it was still a fortune. It was still their only way out. She placed the diary carefully on top of the bags, the dark green cover looking like a tombstone over the glittering wealth. She slammed the heavy lid of the suitcase shut, the sound echoing in the confined space. The brass clasps clicked into place, sealing the secret once more, but it was too late. The secret was out. It was in her head, a burning, terrifying knowledge. She looked at the empty black hole in the wall, the canvas-lined compartment that had hidden this story for so long. She felt an overwhelming urge to put the suitcase back, to replace the stone, to seal the tomb and pretend she had never found it, to go back to the simple, if miserable, reality of hunger and poverty, but she knew she couldn't. The discovery had changed everything. There was no going back. She had a choice to make. A choice that went far beyond how to spend the money. It was a choice about justice, about history, and about the nature of the treasure itself. With a final surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she heaved the heavy suitcase toward the stone steps. It was a dead weight, a burden of both wealth and sin. She would have to drag it up, step by agonizing step, into the light. Lucas's voice called down again, this time more urgently. "Mom, is everything okay? I'm getting scared." The sound of his voice snapped her back to the present. Him, Lucas, was the reason for all of this. This treasure, whatever its origin, was his future. It was his escape from a life of want. Her resolve hardened. She would deal with the ghosts later. For now, this was their lifeline. "I'm coming, sweetie," she called up, her voice trembling but strong. "I'm coming, and I found something. I think everything is going to be okay." The lie and the truth of that statement warred within her as she began the arduous task of dragging her impossible, terrible, wonderful discovery out of the darkness. The journey up the stairs was a grueling ordeal. Helen had to haul the suitcase up one step at a time, her muscles screaming, her back aching. It scraped and bumped against the stone, the sound a dull, rhythmic testament to its incredible weight. When she finally emerged from the trapdoor, covered in dirt and sweat, blinking in the grey daylight, Lucas was staring at her, his eyes wide. He looked from his mother's dishevelled state to the huge, mysterious leather case. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice a mixture of fear and awe. Helen didn't open it. Not yet. Not here. She couldn't bear to see the gold again until she had time to think. "It's a chance, honey," she said, her voice strained. "It's a chance for us." She dragged the case to the driest corner of the cabin, her mind already spinning, trying to process the enormity of what lay sealed inside the dark leather. The mystery had just begun. Hours later, after hauling the suitcase into the cabin and hiding it beneath a pile of damp, rotting floorboards, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, trembling anxiety. The gold was real. The fortune was real. But the diary, with its dark leather cover and spidery foreign script, felt like a venomous snake coiled atop the treasure. Helen sat on the filthy floor, the book resting in her lap, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Lucas was asleep, exhausted by the day's turmoil, huddled under their only blanket. The silence of the cabin pressed in, no longer just empty, but filled with a heavy, waiting presence. She felt an overwhelming compulsion to understand the words trapped within the yellowed pages. She had to know the story of the gold. It was a story that now, inexplicably, was intertwined with her own. Her salvation was tied to this dark object, and she needed to know the price of that salvation. She felt her heart tighten with a terrible premonition. The truth, she suspected, would be as heavy as the coins themselves. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. The screen glowed with a comforting light, a portal back to a world she understood. The battery icon showed a terrifyingly low 15%. The signal bars flickered, one moment there, the next gone. It was a fragile, tenuous link to the outside world. She carefully opened an online translator app, the familiar interface a strange contrast to the ancient diary in her lap. She would have to do this piece by piece, typing in the strange Gothic letters one by one. Praying the signal held and the battery lasted, she turned to the first page, her finger tracing the date, September 1942. The candle flame flickered beside her, casting dancing shadows on the wall as she began the painstaking work of transcribing the first few sentences. The air grew cold, and a shiver that had nothing to do with the dampness of the cabin traced its way down her spine. She was about to open a door to the past, and she was terrified of what she would find on the other side. She felt like a grave robber, disturbing a history that was meant to stay buried. The translation was slow and fragmented, the app struggling with the archaic script and grammar, but the words that appeared on her screen, broken and disjointed, were enough to make her blood run cold. Confiscation from the ghetto, Warsaw, gold from the teeth of traitors. The phrases were like gut punches. She felt a wave of nausea so strong she had to stop, her stomach churning. This wasn't a family inheritance. This wasn't the life savings of a thrifty immigrant. A horrifying picture began to form in her mind, a picture painted in ash and blood. She frantically typed in another sentence, her fingers slipping on the screen. The translation appeared, "The Zilberstein family, their entire worth in one suitcase, foolish to hide it in the walls." A name. A Jewish family name. The abstract horror suddenly became personal, specific. She could almost see them. A family like her own, their life's work, their future, reduced to a line in a Nazi officer's diary. The velvet bags in the suitcase were not just bags of coins. They were the stolen legacies of real people. A cold, greasy sweat broke out across her forehead. The weight of the gold hidden beneath the floor felt like it was pressing down on her, suffocating her. She found the signature at the end of an entry, the one with the swastika drawn beside it. and carefully typed the name into the translator, Klaus Richter. Below it, a rank, Obersturmführer, SS. The letters glowed on her phone screen with a malevolent light. An SS officer. The man who had lived in this cabin, who had built this secret compartment, was a monster, a key figure in the machinery of genocide. The man whose stolen plunder was now her only hope. The irony was so bitter, so grotesque, it made her want to scream. She had fled poverty only to stumble into the heart of a historical crime. The diary was a confession, a boastful catalogue of theft and atrocity, written by a man utterly devoid of remorse. He wrote of the gold not as a crime, but as a prize, a reward for his service to a vile cause. The sense of elation she had felt in the cellar was now a burning, corrosive shame. The story unfolded through the fractured translations. After the war, Richter had escaped Germany through the Rat Lines, a network that helped Nazis flee justice. He had come here, to this remote corner of America, with his stolen fortune. He bought this piece of land under an assumed name, built the cabin, and hid his blood money, planning to wait until the world forgot, until he could re-emerge and live in luxury. The diary spoke of a local man who had helped him, an American who knew he was a fugitive, but was bought off with a handful of coins and the promise of more. But Richter never got his chance. A final, brief entry, written in a different, shakier hand, provided the epilogue. It was from the American accomplice. The German is dead, sudden fever. The secret of the rest is with him in his grave. Richter had died here, in this cabin, taking the exact location of his treasure with him. The gold had been waiting in the dark ever since, a silent, cursed inheritance. The phone battery icon turned red. 10%. The screen dimmed. Helen slammed the diary shut, a choked sob escaping her throat. The coins weren't a lifeline, they were an anchor, dragging her down into a moral abyss. Every single gleaming piece was stained with the tears and blood of innocent people, the Zilberstein family, and how many others. Using it to save herself and Lucas felt like becoming an accomplice to the original crime, a scavenger feasting on the spoils of genocide. But what was the alternative? To leave it, to turn it in and be left with nothing, to face eviction and homelessness with her son. The despair she had felt before was a simple, clean pain compared to this. This was a soul sickness, a choice between her survival and her conscience. She stared into the flickering candle flame, her face streaked with tears. The gold was a poison, and she was being forced to choose whether or not to drink it. She felt the ghosts of the Zilberstein family in the room with her, their silent judgment a crushing weight on her spirit. The money could save her son's life, but she feared it would cost her soul. Just as her mind reached its breaking point, a sound sliced through the oppressive silence of the wilderness. It was a sound so alien to this place that it was instantly terrifying. The low, powerful rumble of an expensive car engine. It grew steadily louder, coming down the muddy track that had almost broken them. Headlights cut through the trees, sweeping across the front of the ruined cabin, momentarily blinding Helen through the shattered windows. Her heart leapt into her throat, pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm. Who would be coming here, in the middle of nowhere? To this forgotten ruin, the engine cut off, and the sudden return to silence was even more menacing. Then came the sound of a car door closing with a solid, expensive thump, followed by the squelch of heavy footsteps approaching through the mud. It was a confident, deliberate tread, the sound of someone who owned the ground they walked on. Helen scrambled to her feet, her body rigid with fear, every nerve ending screaming with alarm. She instinctively stood between the door and where Lucas was sleeping. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed on the flimsy doorframe. It wasn't a tentative or friendly knock, it was a demand. "Hello? Anyone in there?" The voice was smooth, educated, and dripping with an unnerving confidence. It was not the voice of a lost hiker. Helen's throat was dry, her voice gone. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. She was paralyzed by a primal fear. The knock came again, harder this time. "I know you're in there. I own all the land around this lake. I make it my business to know everything that happens on it." The words were a clear statement of power. This man wasn't a visitor, he was a proprietor, and she was a trespasser on his domain. Taking a shaky breath, she forced her limbs to move, to open the sagging door just a crack. The man standing on her porch was a stark, jarring contrast to the decay surrounding him. He was tall, in his late 60s, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and gleaming leather shoes, somehow miraculously clean despite the mud. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and a polite, thin-lipped smile sat on his face, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating grey eyes. "Alistair Finch," he said, extending a manicured hand which Helen did not take. His eyes flickered over her dishevelled appearance and the squalor of the cabin's interior with a look of barely concealed distaste. "Forgive the intrusion. As I said, I own the surrounding properties, and I was surprised to hear this old wreck was occupied. I was under the impression it was condemned." His tone was deceptively pleasant, but his gaze was sharp, predatory, like a hawk surveying its territory. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering for a moment on the disturbed floorboards where she had hidden the suitcase. A cold knot of dread tightened in Helen's stomach. He knew. He didn't know what she had found or where, but he knew something was here. The diary's mention of an American accomplice, a local man, flashed in her mind. This had to be his heir, his grandson, the man who had been searching for the treasure his entire life, the man whose family got mysteriously rich after the German's death. He wasn't here by chance. He had been watching this property. He had been waiting. Mr. Finch's smile widened, becoming a predatory grin. "It's a dreadful place, isn't it? An eyesore. I've been meaning to tear it down for years, consolidate the parcel into my estate." He spoke of her new home, her only refuge, as if it were a piece of garbage to be swept away. The casual arrogance in his voice made Helen's fear begin to curdle into a hot, protective anger. She thought of Lucas sleeping, of the unimaginable fortune hidden beneath her feet. This man was a vulture, circling a secret he felt entitled to. "I was surprised when my agent told me someone had put a down payment on it. A foolish investment, if you don't mind me saying, but perhaps I can help you rectify that." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook and an elegant fountain pen. The simple objects looked like weapons in his hand. He was here to claim what he believed was his birthright, the final missing piece of the treasure his grandfather had failed to secure. He was the second ghost of this place, and he was far more dangerous than the one in the diary. He clicked the cap off his pen. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet cabin. "I'm prepared to offer you $1,000 for the property. Cash. It's twice what you paid for the down payment. A generous offer. I think you'll agree. You can take the money, go back to the city, and forget this miserable place ever existed. I'm having the papers drawn up. It's a simple quitclaim deed. You sign it, and you walk away with a small profit. It's the best outcome for everyone. Believe me." He said the words with an air of finality, as if her agreement was a foregone conclusion. $1,000. The offer was a calculated insult. He was testing her, trying to see if she was just a desperate fool or if she knew the true value of the dirt she was standing on. He was offering her scraps from a table he believed was laden with a feast. He held the pen poised over the check, his cold eyes locked on hers, waiting. The air was thick with unspoken threats and the immense invisible weight of the hidden gold. A week ago, $1,000 would have been a miracle, a sum so vast it would have solved all her problems. Now, it was nothing. It was a joke. Helen looked at this powerful, smug man, and a new kind of strength, born of desperation and the sheer insanity of her situation, solidified within her. She was the guardian of a terrible secret, the keeper of a cursed fortune, and the protector of her son. She would not be dismissed so easily. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was firm, solid as a rock. "The property is not for sale." She felt a thrill of terror and defiance as she spoke the words. For the first time in over a year, she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a player in a dangerous game, and she had just made her first move. The simple refusal, the act of standing up to this man, sent a surge of power through her veins. It was the most terrifying and liberating thing she had ever done. Alistair Finch's smile did not falter, but it became something brittle and cold, like a sheet of ice. The pleasant facade cracked, and for a second she saw the raw, greedy hunger beneath. He slowly, deliberately, put his checkbook back into his pocket. "I see," he said, his voice dropping, losing its feigned warmth and taking on a menacing, silken edge. "Perhaps you don't understand the situation, madam. This area, it's quite remote, isolated. People who live out here learn to be cooperative. They understand the landscape. He took a small step closer, invading her personal space, his expensive cologne a cloying, suffocating scent in the mouldy air. He was no longer asking, he was warning. His eyes, cold and grey as the lake itself, held a chilling promise of violence. The power he wielded was not just in his money, but in the isolation and lawlessness of this forgotten place. He was the king here, and she had just defied him. "This lake is very deep, you know," he continued, his voice a low, conversational murmur that was more terrifying than a shout. "And the woods are dense. Accidents happen all the time. Tragic, unavoidable accidents. A slip on a wet rock. A fire from a stray candle in a dry, old tinderbox like this one." His gaze flickered meaningfully toward Lucas, who was still asleep under the blanket, a small, vulnerable lump in the corner of the room. Especially when single mothers are involved. Distracted, you see, overwhelmed, with curious little boys who like to wander off and explore. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a cold, sharp blade pressed against her throat, aimed directly at the one thing in the world she loved. He was telling her, in no uncertain terms, that he was capable of anything to get what he wanted, and that she and her son were nothing more than disposable obstacles in his path. The blood drained from Helen's face, and a primal, animalistic fear for her child seized her. He let the threat hang in the air, a poisonous cloud in the small cabin. Then his charming smile returned, a grotesque mask snapping back into place. "I'll be back in 1 week," he said, his voice once again light and pleasant, "to give you time to reconsider my generous offer. I do hope you make the sensible choice." He gave a slight nod, turned, and walked away, his footsteps sure and steady in the mud. Helen stood frozen in the doorway, watching his car's red taillights disappear into the darkness, a demonic red glow swallowed by the forest. She was shaking so violently she could barely stand. The silence that descended was 1,000 times more terrifying than before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with his promise. A week. She had 1 week. The treasure was no longer a secret between her and the ghost of a Nazi. The dragon had awoken, and it knew she was in its lair. What would you do in her place? Would you hand over the blood money to a monster to protect your child, or would you try to fight, knowing that failure could mean death? The thick, cloying scent of Alistair Finch's cologne lingered in the cabin long after his car had vanished, a phantom presence that was more terrifying than the mold. Helen stood in the doorway, her body rigid, every muscle locked in a state of pure, primal terror. The silence of the forest rushed back in, but it was different now. It was no longer a neutral quiet. It was the silence of a predator's lair, the heavy, watchful stillness before a strike. Finch's words echoed in her mind, not as a memory but as a living entity, coiling around her heart and squeezing the air from her lungs. The lake is deep. Accidents happen. Curious little boys. He hadn't just threatened her. He had shown her a detailed blueprint of her own death, of her son's death. A wave of nausea, cold and acidic, rose in her throat. She stumbled back from the door, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. The floorboards beneath her feet felt unsteady, the entire world tilting on a precarious, terrifying axis. She was trapped, a fly caught in a spider's web, and the spider had just promised to return. A shiver, violent and uncontrollable, racked her body. It started deep in her bones, a seismic tremor of fear that made her teeth chatter. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold wasn't external. It was inside her, a spreading paralysis of dread. Her gaze darted to the corner where Lucas slept, a small innocent form wrapped in a thin blanket. The sight of him, so peaceful and unaware of the monstrous threat that now hung over their heads, shattered her paralysis and replaced it with a burning, protective rage that was hotter and more powerful than her fear. This wasn't about gold or a cursed treasure anymore. This was about survival. This was about her child. The image Finch had planted in her mind, of Lucas. Lost and alone in the woods, a tragic accident, was a poison, but it was also an antidote to her despair. It burned away her hesitation, her moral quandary. The ghosts of the Zilberstein family were silent. The immediate, living monster was at her door. Her heart, which had been frozen with terror, now began to pound with a new, ferocious rhythm. The the rhythm of a mother bear whose cub was threatened. Finch had said 1 week. It was a lie. Helen knew it with a certainty that was absolute and chilling. He wasn't a man who gave second chances. He was a man who crushed opposition. The smile, the tailored suit, the polite words, it was all a costume, a thin veneer over a core of ruthless greed. He had seen defiance in her eyes when she refused his insulting offer, and he would not tolerate it. He had been searching for this treasure his entire life, the obsession of his family for 2 generations. He wasn't going to wait a week for a destitute woman in a shack to reconsider. He was going to come back. He was going to come back soon, tonight. The intuition was so strong, so clear, it was like a shout in the silent cabin. She had to move, not tomorrow, not in an hour. Now they had to run, but they couldn't just run. The suitcase, the source of all this danger, was also their only hope. She couldn't leave it for him. But she couldn't possibly carry its impossible weight while fleeing for their lives. Her mind raced, sifting through the terrifyingly few options available to them. The well. The idea surfaced from the depths of her panic, a single point of clarity in the chaos. He didn't know about the well. He didn't know about the secret compartment. He had scanned the cabin, his eyes lingering on the disturbed floorboards, but the well was outside, hidden in plain sight. It was the place where the secret had begun, and it would be the place where she would hide it again. It was their only chance. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice tight and urgent as she gently shook his shoulder. "Lucas, wake up. We have to do something now." The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with sleep. He sat up, rubbing his face, looking at her with confusion. The fear in his mother's eyes, stark and raw in the flickering candlelight, woke him up instantly. "What is it, Mom? Is that man coming back?" His voice was a small, trembling whisper. Helen pulled him close, her hand stroking his hair, trying to project a calm she was nowhere near feeling. "We're going to play a game, sweetie. A hiding game. We have to hide the suitcase right now. It's the most important game we will ever play." The process was a frantic, desperate scramble against a ticking clock she could feel in her own pulse. She unearthed the heavy suitcase from its shallow hiding place under the floor, the leather cool and solid in her trembling hands. The sheer weight of it was a reminder of the stakes. Inside, the gold was a silent, glittering hoard, and the diary lay on top like a dark prophecy. She had found a roll of thick oilcloth in a rotten crate in the corner of the cabin, likely left by Richter himself. It smelled of chemicals and age. With Lucas helping her, his small hands surprisingly steady, they wrapped the entire suitcase in the protective material, creating a bulky, waterproof bundle. "We have to put it back where we found it, honey," she explained, her voice a low, hurried whisper. "Back in the secret spot in the well. It's the only place he won't look." Lucas nodded, his young face grim with an understanding that was far beyond his years. He seemed to grasp the life-or-death gravity of the situation, his childhood innocence burning away in the crucible of this terrifying night. Moving the heavy, awkward bundle out of the cabin and across the muddy yard was an agonizing struggle. The night was pitch black, the moon and stars completely obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. The only light was the single, sputtering candle Helen carried, its flame threatening to extinguish with every gust of wind. The air was cold and smelled of rain and damp earth. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the surrounding forest sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that Finch's cold grey eyes were watching them from the impenetrable darkness of the trees. The suitcase seemed to fight her, its weight a dead, pulling force, a physical manifestation of the curse it carried. Lucas pushed from behind, his small body straining with the effort, his breath coming in ragged little puffs. They were a pair of desperate conspirators, burying a secret that was both their salvation and their potential doom, their movements a frantic ballet of fear in the suffocating darkness of the wilderness. At the edge of the well, Helen's heart hammered against her ribs. The circular stone structure looked like a gaping mouth in the night, a portal to some dark, cold underworld. The smell of stagnant water and deep earth was stronger now, a chilling miasma that clung to the air. She handed the candle to Lucas. "Hold this, sweetie, and don't look down." Her voice was a strained whisper. She knelt in the cold mud, her fingers, already scraped raw, fumbling for the edge of the heavy, loose stone. It took all her strength to pull it free again. the grating sound of stone on stone seeming deafeningly loud in the silent night. The black niche was revealed, a perfect void waiting to reclaim its secret. The air that came from it was dry and ancient. She felt a moment of profound hesitation. She was about to voluntarily surrender the fortune that could save them, putting it back into the earth, trusting that she could retrieve it later. It felt like burying her own hope, but the alternative, letting Finch find it, was unthinkable. It was a choice made in a heartbeat. Lowering the heavy, oilcloth-wrapped suitcase into the narrow compartment was even harder than getting it out. It was a clumsy, awkward fit. Helen had to get on her stomach in the mud, reaching deep into the cold stone recess, her shoulder grinding against the rough-hewn rock. The canvas of the lining was cold and slick against her skin. Lucas, holding the candle with both hands to keep it steady, was her only anchor to the world of light. His small, pale face, illuminated by the trembling flame, was a mask of concentration and fear. Finally, with a last, desperate shove, the bundle slid fully into the compartment. It was done. Helen felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. The treasure was safe. Finch could tear the cabin apart, but he would never find it. Now all they had to do was run. She took the heavy stone, her muscles screaming in protest, and began to slide it back into place, sealing the tomb on the Nazis' blood money once more. The stone grated, a low rumbling sound, as it settled back into its socket. It fit perfectly, the moss and dirt around its edges making it nearly indistinguishable from its neighbors once more. It was as if the secret had never been disturbed. Helen sat back on her heels, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exertion and relief. She had done it. They were ready. They could run. They would go to the fisherman, the only other soul for miles. She would beg for his help, for the use of a phone. She looked at Lucas, a weak smile touching her lips. "We did it, buddy. Now we go." She stood up, brushing the cold mud from her clothes, and took the candle from him. In that exact moment, a low rumble vibrated through the soles of her shoes. It was a sound that didn't belong to the forest. It was the sound of an engine. Her blood ran cold. The smile froze on her face. Her brief moment of triumph evaporated, replaced by a pure, unadulterated terror that was sharper and more immediate than anything she had felt before. It was the same powerful, expensive engine, and it was coming fast. A pair of brilliant white headlights suddenly sliced through the oppressive darkness of the forest, pinning them in their glare like frightened animals. They were caught out in the open, by the well, the very scene of their crime. There was no time to run, no time to hide. The car screeched to a halt not 20 feet away, its engine idling with a menacing growl, the headlights turning the muddy yard into a stark, overlit stage. Helen instinctively threw herself in front of Lucas, shielding his body with her own, her mind screaming. He knew. How could he know? The car doors flew open. Two large, hulking shadows emerged, their forms silhouetted against the blinding lights. They were not dressed in suits. They were dressed for violence, in dark work clothes, their faces obscured by the glare. They moved with a brutal, predatory efficiency, their heavy boots splashing through the mud as they advanced on the cabin, ignoring Helen and Lucas completely for a moment. One of the men kicked the flimsy front door of the cabin off its rusted hinges. It crashed inwards with a splintering roar that echoed across the lake. The other man turned his head, his face a brutish mask in the harsh light. He pointed a thick, meaty finger at Helen. "Finch is done waiting," he yelled, his voice a coarse, gravelly bark that ripped through the night. "You got 10 minutes. 10 minutes to give us the suitcase. After that, we got a gallon of gas and a book of matches. He don't care if you and the kid are inside when it goes up. 10 minutes." The words were a physical blow, knocking the last of the air from Helen's lungs. The threat was no longer a silken whisper. It was a screaming, immediate reality. Gasoline and matches. The image of the cabin consumed by flames, of the rotting wood becoming a funeral pyre, flashed in her mind. Her legs felt weak, threatening to buckle. The men stomped into the cabin, and the sound of destruction began almost immediately. The crash of furniture, the splintering of wood, their shouted curses echoing in the night. They were trapped. The two henchmen were between them, and the dark safety of the woods. The car was behind them, its engine a low, constant threat. Helen's mind was a frantic vortex of panic. She pulled Lucas tighter against her, her eyes darting around the small, muddy yard, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The sounds from the cabin were escalating. A loud crash, followed by the tinkling of shattering glass. The men were tearing the place apart, searching for the treasure that wasn't there. 10 minutes. The deadline was a ticking bomb. Helen's gaze fell upon the dark, solid wall of the forest that bordered the back of the cabin. It was a tangled, thorny mess of undergrowth, but it was their only chance. The men were inside, focused on their search, their backs to the rear of the hovel, the back window. She remembered it was broken, but the frame was still there, hidden in deep shadow, away from the blinding glare of the headlights. It was a desperate, insane gamble, but it was the only one they had. "Listen to me, Lucas," she whispered, her mouth right next to his ear, her voice barely audible over the sounds of destruction and her own pounding heart. "We're going to crawl. We're going to stay in the shadows and crawl to the back of the house. Don't make a sound. Don't even breathe. Do you understand?" The boy nodded against her chest, his small body trembling but silent. He was terrified, but he was brave. Helen took a deep breath, the cold, damp air stinging her lungs. She lowered herself and Lucas to the ground, the wet mud instantly soaking through their thin clothes. On their hands and knees, they began to move, a slow, agonizing crawl around the side of the cabin, keeping to the deepest part of the shadows cast by the structure itself. The ground was cold and slick, littered with sharp rocks and broken glass that pricked at her palms. Every few feet, she would freeze, listening to the men inside, praying they wouldn't come out. The sound of a board being ripped from the wall made her flinch, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. They reached the back of the cabin. It was in near total darkness, shielded from the car's headlights. The back window was a dark, gaping square about 4 feet off the ground. The wood of the sill was rotten and soft. Helen pushed on it, and a piece crumbled away in her hand. It was their only way out. She had to get Lucas through first. "I'm going to lift you up," she breathed. "Climb through as quietly as you can and drop to the other side. Don't move until I'm with you." She cupped her hands, and Lucas placed his muddy shoe into them. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she lifted him up. He scrambled through the opening, his small form disappearing into the darkness within the cabin for a terrifying second before she heard the soft thud of his feet hitting the floorboards inside. A shout from the front of the cabin made her heart stop. "Nothing here, let's check the floor." They were getting closer to the hiding spot that was now empty. She didn't have a second to spare. With a desperate heave, she pulled herself up and tumbled through the window frame, landing hard on the floor beside Lucas. The stench of mold inside the cabin was thick and suffocating. The sounds of the men were terrifyingly close now, just on the other side of the single large room. They were stomping on the floorboards, looking for a hollow sound. Helen grabbed Lucas's hand, her grip like a vice, and pulled him towards the opposite wall, to the other back window that led out into the forest. This one was also shattered. They didn't have time to be quiet now. A triumphant yell from one of the men. "Here, this one's loose." They had found the empty hiding place. In seconds, they would realize the suitcase was gone, and their search would move outside. "Go, go now," Helen hissed, shoving Lucas towards the window. He scrambled through, dropping into the thorny bushes below. Helen followed a second later, the sharp branches scratching her face and arms, the pain barely registering. They were out. They were in the forest, but they were not yet safe. Behind them, an enraged roar echoed from the cabin. "They're gone! The damn suitcase is gone! Find them!" The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of wet leaves, tangled roots, and sharp rocks. The darkness was absolute, a thick black ink that swallowed all light and sense of direction. Helen grabbed Lucas's hand and ran. They ran blindly, propelled by pure terror, crashing through undergrowth that tore at their clothes and skin. The sound of their own ragged, panicked breathing filled their ears, mingling with the frantic thumping of their hearts. Behind them, they could hear the henchmen crashing out of the cabin, their heavy footsteps pounding on the earth, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. "You can't hide. Finch owns this whole damn forest." A powerful beam of light from a flashlight suddenly cut through the darkness. Sweeping through the trees, dangerously close to them, Helen ducked, pulling Lucas down behind a large, moss-covered log, her hand clamped over his mouth to stifle his frightened gasps. The beam passed just over their heads, illuminating the swirling mist of their own breath in the cold air. They couldn't stay hidden. They had to keep moving. As soon as the beam of light passed, Helen pulled Lucas to his feet, and they ran again, deeper into the suffocating blackness of the woods. Her lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, but she kept going, driven by the image of her son's face, the feeling of his small hand in hers. Thorns ripped at her arms, leaving fiery trails of pain. A low-hanging branch struck her forehead, making her vision swim for a moment, but she didn't slow down. The shouts behind them were growing more distant, but she knew the men were still searching, still hunting them. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to put as much distance as possible between them and the cabin. She remembered a faint, flickering light she had seen once, far across the lake. The fisherman, Silas. It was a desperate, impossible goal, miles away through this treacherous terrain, but it was the only destination her panicked mind could cling to. It was their only beacon of hope in a world that had become a waking nightmare. After what felt like an eternity of running, the shouts behind them finally faded, replaced by the sound of the wind in the pines and their own heaving breaths. They stumbled to a halt, Helen leaning against the rough bark of a massive pine tree, trying to draw air into her burning lungs. Lucas collapsed at her feet, his small body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Helen slid down the trunk to the cold, damp ground and pulled him into her lap, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce, protective embrace. "It's okay, baby, we're okay," she whispered, the lie a familiar, bitter taste in her mouth. They were not okay. They were lost, cold, and being hunted in a dark, unfamiliar forest. But they were alive, and the treasure was safe. For now, that was enough. She rocked him gently, her own body trembling, listening to the sounds of the night, trying to distinguish between the innocent noises of the woods and the footsteps of the men who wanted them dead. The silence was a fragile, temporary truce in a war she had no idea how to win. Suddenly, a new light appeared in the distance, back in the direction of the cabin. It wasn't the sweeping beam of a flashlight. It was a flickering, hungry, orange glow that began to climb the trunks of the trees, painting the underside of the heavy clouds with a sickening, pulsating light. Fire. They had done it. They had set the cabin on fire. A gut-wrenching sob escaped Helen's throat. The ruined hovel, the source of so much misery and a flicker of hope, was now a funeral pyre. The men were not making empty threats. They were capable of anything. The orange glow grew brighter, more intense, a malevolent, fiery eye staring at them through the trees. It was a beacon of hate, a signal from Finch that this was not over. It was a promise that he would burn down their entire world to get what he wanted. The sight filled Helen not with more fear, but with a cold, hard resolve. She had to find the fisherman. She had to find help. She had to fight back. She gently lifted Lucas to his feet. "Come on, sweetie," she said, her voice now steady, imbued with a new, icy determination. "We have to keep going." They stumbled through the darkness, Helen now guided by a strange, new instinct. She pushed them away from the horrifying glow of the fire, keeping the unseen lake somewhere to her left. The terrain was brutal, a series of steep, muddy inclines and thick, swampy hollows. Her ankle twisted on a loose rock, and she cried out in pain, but forced herself to keep moving, limping heavily, dragging Lucas along with her. Time lost all meaning. There was only the next step, and the next, a grueling, endless journey through the cold and the dark. The memory of the fire propelled her forward, a constant reminder of the stakes. She was no longer just a victim running from a monster. She was a guardian, protecting not just her son, but a terrible, valuable secret. She carried the weight of the Zilberstein family's legacy, and she would not let a man like Alistair Finch claim it. The thought gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Her pain, her fear, her exhaustion, they were all fuel for the cold, burning anger in her heart. Just when she felt she couldn't take another step, when her legs were about to give out completely, she saw it, through a break in the trees, a single, weak, yellow light. It wasn't the angry orange of the fire. It was a small, steady, welcoming glow, a lamp in a window, a cabin, smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin grey ribbon against the black sky, carrying the faint, comforting scent of burning wood. It had to be him. It had to be Silas's house. A surge of desperate hope, so powerful it was painful, flooded through her. They were close. They might actually make it. "Look, Lucas, look," she gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "A house! We're almost there!" The sight of that small solitary light gave them the last burst of energy they needed. They scrambled down a final steep embankment, their shoes sliding in the mud, and emerged from the tree line into a small, clear patch of land on the shore of the vast Black Lake. There, nestled amongst the pines, was a small, well-kept log cabin, a bastion of warmth and safety in the immense, hostile darkness. They ran across the clearing, their feet sinking into the soft, damp ground. Helen was half carrying Lucas now, his small body limp with exhaustion. She stumbled up the 3 solid wooden steps to the porch and began to pound on the heavy oak door with her fist, her desperate blows echoing in the night. "Please!" she cried out, her voice raw and cracking. "Please, help us! Please, somebody help us!" For a long, terrifying moment, there was no answer. The only sound was the wind and her own ragged breathing. She pounded again, harder this time, a frantic, desperate rhythm. "Please, we're in trouble. My son, please." A light appeared in the window next to the door. A moment later, she heard the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn. The door creaked open a few inches, and a face peered out. It was the face of an old man, deeply wrinkled and weathered like ancient leather, his eyes, sharp and intelligent under a craggy brow, narrowed with suspicion. A cloud of pipe smoke, smelling of sweet tobacco and cherry wood, drifted out into the cold night air. "What do you want?" the old man growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. His eyes, even in the dim light, were a startlingly bright blue. They flicked from Helen's scratched, tear-streaked face to the trembling boy hiding behind her legs, then out towards the dark forest from which they had emerged. He was holding a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand, holding it like a weapon. Helen gasped for breath, the words tumbling out in a panicked, incoherent rush. "Finch! Alistair Finch! He tried to kill us. He set our cabin on fire. Please, you have to help us. You're the only one—" At the mention of Finch's name, the old man's expression changed. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flash of ancient anger and a flicker of understanding. He opened the door wider. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice still gruff, but now lacking its earlier hostility. "Get inside now, before you bring his trouble to my doorstep." He pulled them into the small, warm room and quickly bolted the door behind them, the sound of the heavy iron shooting home, a temporary seal against the horrors of the night. The inside of the cabin was a single room, warm and cluttered, but impeccably clean. It smelled of wood smoke, old books, and drying fish. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm, dancing glow over everything. It was the safest place Helen had been in for what felt like a lifetime. The old man, Silas, took one look at Lucas's pale, shivering form and immediately softened. He scooped the boy up in his surprisingly strong arms and deposited him in a large, comfortable armchair by the fire, wrapping him in a thick wool blanket. He then turned to Helen, handing her a tin cup of hot steaming water from a kettle on the hearth. "You said Finch," he stated, his voice a low rumble as he lit his pipe, his bright blue eyes fixed on her. "That man is a poison on this lake. I'm Silas. I knew his grandfather, and I knew the German he cheated." The words hung in the air, a stunning confirmation of everything Helen had suspected. She had not run to a random stranger. She had run to the one person in the world who knew the truth. Helen stared at him, her mind reeling. "The German Richter?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Silas nodded grimly, taking a long pull from his pipe, the cherry ember glowing in the dim light. That was his name. He showed up here after the war, a quiet, haunted man with too much money and a dark secret. My father told me to stay away from him. The only person he ever talked to was Old Man Finch, Alistair's grandfather, a greedy, worthless man who'd sell his own soul for $1. He walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness, his silhouette framed against the glass. He pointed a gnarled finger towards the distant, horrifying orange glow that was still visible across the black water of the lake. Finch's grandfather helped the German hide his war money, but the German died of a fever before he could tell him where it was all buried. The Finches got a little bit of it, enough to make them rich overnight. but not the main horde. They've been looking for it ever since, buying up the land, keeping people away. They've spent 70 years hunting for what you just found. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just about Alistair Finch's personal greed. This was his family's legacy, a multi-generational obsession born from a deal with a Nazi devil. Finch wasn't just trying to rob her, he was trying to complete his grandfather's work, to claim the cursed treasure that had been denied to his family for decades. The fire across the lake was not just an act of intimidation, it was an expression of pure, frustrated rage. He had come so close, only to have a destitute widow and her child stumble upon the prize he felt was his by birthright. Helen felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She had not just stepped on a snake, she had stumbled into a nest of them, a family bound by a 70-year-old secret of greed and betrayal. The story in the diary and the story from Silas's memory were two halves of the same dark tale, and she and Lucas were now caught in its violent, bloody conclusion. The fight for the treasure was a fight against history itself. Silas turned from the window, his weathered face set in grim lines. "He won't stop," he said, his voice low and certain. "Now that he knows the treasure is real, now that he knows you found it, he will never stop. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." He looked at the sleeping boy by the fire, then back at Helen, his gaze filled with a weary sympathy. "You can't run from a man like that. Running is a temporary solution. There's only one way to stop him. You have to cut the head off the snake." He gestured towards an old-fashioned rotary dial telephone sitting on a small wooden table in the corner of the room. It was a relic from another era, but in this moment, it was the most beautiful object Helen had ever seen. "I had a long and nasty fight with the Finch family over property lines 20 years ago," Silas said, a flicker of a grim smile on his lips. "It went all the way to the federal level. I made some contacts back then. People who don't like bullies and land barons, people who have the power to stop a man like Alistair Finch for good." The old fisherman was not just an ally, he was a guardian, a keeper of history, and, Helen realized with a surge of hope, he was her weapon. The old rotary phone felt like a relic from another world, its heavy black plastic cool and solid under Helen's trembling fingers. Guided by Silas's gnarled hand, she dialed the long-distance number he had recited from memory. Each turn of the dial was a loud mechanical whir, followed by a satisfying click, a sound that seemed to measure out the final, desperate beats of her old life. The air in the warm cabin was thick with the scent of Silas's cherry wood pipe smoke and the crackling pine fire, a cocoon of safety against the terrifying night. When a calm, professional voice finally answered, Helen's own voice was a fractured, reedy thing. "My name is Helen. Mr. Silas told me to call. I have evidence of a war crime, and a man named Alistair Finch. He just tried to murder me and my son." As she spoke the words aloud, the full, insane reality of her situation washed over her, and she had to grip the phone with both hands to keep from collapsing, the plastic slick with sweat. The ghost of Klaus Richter had finally found a voice. The wait was a unique form of torment, a suspension between terror and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Dawn broke across the lake, a wash of bruised purple and soft grey, revealing the ugly black scar on the opposite shore where the cabin had stood. The fire was out, but a plume of greasy smoke still soiled the morning sky. Lucas slept deeply in the armchair, his face finally relaxed, the wool blanket rising and falling with his steady breath. Silas sat across from Helen, silently refilling her tin cup with hot water as she, in a low, halting voice, recounted the entire story. The diary, the SS officer, the Zilberstein family, the gold. She spoke of the weight of the coins and the heavier weight of the secret. Silas listened without interruption, his bright blue eyes never leaving her face, his expression a mixture of grim validation and profound pity. The only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and the slow, deliberate tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second a hammer blow of anticipation. The first sound was not a siren, but a deep, rhythmic chopping that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the floorboards of the cabin. A helicopter. Helen and Silas rushed to the window, just as it broke through the low clouds, a dark, menacing shape that circled the lake once before descending towards Finch's sprawling estate on the far side. Moments later, the rumble of heavy engines joined the cacophony. A convoy of black-eyed unmarked SUVs, their lights flashing but sirens silent, came charging down the muddy track, moving with an unstoppable, disciplined force. They didn't stop at the smouldering ruins of Helen's cabin, but continued on, surrounding the iron gates of Finch's property. Agents in dark tactical gear, armed with rifles, spilled out of the vehicles, moving with a quiet, lethal efficiency that made Finch's hired thugs seem like clumsy schoolyard bullies. This was not the local police. This was a force of nature, an arm of justice long enough and strong enough to reach even this forgotten, lawless corner of the world. From the relative safety of Silas's porch, Helen watched the raid unfold like a scene from a movie. It was swift, brutal, and breathtakingly efficient. The heavy iron gates to Finch's mansion were breached with a loud metallic groan. Minutes later, the man who had personified untouchable power was being frog-marched out of his front door. Alistair Finch, his impeccable suit now rumpled, his silver hair disheveled, was not smiling. His face was a mask of pure, incandescent rage and utter disbelief, his cold eyes scanning the scene as if searching for someone to blame, someone to destroy. He was followed by his two henchmen, their brutish confidence evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defeated fear. As an agent snapped handcuffs onto Finch's wrists, his gaze swept across the lake and seemed to lock for a moment on Silas's small cabin. Even from that distance, Helen felt a final, parting wave of his venomous hatred. But it was impotent now. The king had been deposed, his castle breached, his reign of terror over. Later that morning, Helen, her fear now replaced by a surreal sense of detachment, led a team of FBI agents back to the well. The lead agent, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes named Carter, listened intently as Helen described the loose stone and the hidden compartment. A forensics team, with professional calm, documented every step. They carefully removed the stone and illuminated the dark niche. With gloved hands, an agent reached in and retrieved the oilcloth-wrapped suitcase. They carried it to a portable table and carefully unwrapped it. In the bright morning light, the gold coins seemed to burn with a cold ancient fire. The agents were silent, their faces grim as they looked upon the hoard. Agent Carter picked up the diary, handling it with the reverence one would an unholy relic. "You did the right thing, Miss Moorcroft," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You've helped us close a case that's been cold for 70 years. You've given a name back to the victims." In that moment, the treasure ceased to be a burden. It became an act of justice. In the weeks that followed, Helen's life became a blur of sterile offices and legal consultations in a city hours away from the lake. Agent Carter explained the complex situation. The treasure was officially seized as assets looted during the Holocaust. A global foundation dedicated to Holocaust restitution was contacted, and an exhaustive search began for any living heirs of the Zilberstein family and others whose names and possessions were catalogued in Richter's meticulous, monstrous diary. The gold and jewels would be returned to them, a small measure of justice across the chasm of time. But under federal law and international agreements regarding the recovery of such assets, the finder, the one who risked their life to bring the crime to light, was entitled to a substantial reward. The government would liquidate a designated portion of the unclaimed assets to create a legal, declared fund for her. The property itself, seized from the now convicted Finch, was also part of the settlement. She was not just safe, she would be secure, forever. The first transfer appeared in her new bank account on a Tuesday. Helen stood at the ATM, her heart pounding, and requested a balance inquiry. The number that flashed on the screen was so long, so filled with commas and zeros, that her brain refused to process it for a full 10 seconds. It was an impossible, fantastical figure. Her knees went weak, and she had to grab the side of the machine to keep from falling. A sob, thick and cathartic, broke from her throat. It was the sound of a lifetime of fear, of counting pennies, of the gnawing ache of hunger, all of it dissolving in an instant. The crushing weight she had carried on her shoulders since her husband's death simply evaporated. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief streamed down her face. She walked out of the bank and went straight to a grocery store, where she bought 3 carts full of food, piling them high with everything she and Lucas had ever wanted. The sheer, mundane act of abundance, the most profound miracle of all. Months later, the cabin was unrecognizable. The sagging, rotten structure was gone, replaced by a beautiful home built on the same footprint, using the original stone fireplace as its heart. The tin roof with its gaping wound was now a sturdy, insulated roof, with a large skylight that flooded the main room with natural light. The smell of mold was a distant memory, replaced by the clean scents of fresh cedar and beeswax. New windows looked out onto the lake, no longer like the vacant eyes of a skull, but as clear portals to the peaceful water. A quiet, efficient furnace hummed in the new, dry cellar, a constant assurance of warmth. The old well had been capped and turned into a stone planter overflowing with flowers, while a new, modern well provided clean, fresh water at the turn of a tap. The property was no longer a grave or a trap. It was a sanctuary, a home built not just with money, but with the foundations of courage and survival, a testament to her victory over the darkness. Peace became the new texture of her days. Helen sat on the wide uncovered porch in a comfortable rocking chair, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. Her new sewing machine sat in the corner of the living room, a high-end model she used not for desperate, penny-pinching repairs, but to design and create beautiful quilts, the hum of the machine a soothing, creative sound. She watched her son, Lucas, standing on the edge of a newly built wooden dock that stretched out over the calm, clear water. He was no longer a pale, trembling child, but a healthy, happy boy, confidently casting a fishing line into the glittering lake. The water, once a symbol of Finch's threat, was now just a lake, beautiful and serene, its surface reflecting the endless blue sky. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the pines, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't make her jump. She felt the knot of anxiety that had lived in her stomach for so long finally, completely dissolve. She had fulfilled her promise. She had taken care of her boy. That evening, the table in the cabin groaned with the weight of a roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and a warm apple pie. The sight was a world away from the empty refrigerator and the jar of mustard that had once constituted their entire pantry. Silas sat at the head of the table, an honorary grandfather, telling Lucas a story about a legendary fish in the lake, his gravelly laughter filling the warm, bright room. Helen watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She had faced down monsters, both living and dead, and had walked through the fire to bring her son to this place of safety and abundance. Her journey proves that even in the deepest darkness, when all hope seems lost, a single spark of courage can ignite a fire of redemption that burns away the past. If her story of resilience, of a mother's fierce love conquering impossible odds, has moved you, subscribe to our channel for more tales of incredible survival and the enduring power of the human spirit.